You should be able to see Donald if John is presenting. Yes.
Yeah. Top left.
Getting both Donalds then.
Getting both Donalds. Sorry, that's
Okay.
Oh, they're getting a wee.
Okay. Go for it.
Okay. Right.
Right, well, Porsche Shinnerist.
Wel, in vaak gehoord allemaal, maar wie heet het?
Han je met alle raak. Sian, han is manjach gael sian o'r ciar,
Yeah, see that.
Lovely to be with you folks, and I hope you're hearing me loud and clear, not only in this room, but in these far-flung corners of cyberspace. It gives me great pleasure to be here today and to talk about a subject close to my own heart, and Bible Gaelic, the Gaelic Bible. As I was brought up in the island of Tiree, I heard preaching from the Gaelic Bible by my own father every Sunday morning in Ballymartin Baptist Church, and I became thoroughly familiar with the text of the Gaelic Bible. That was to serve me well in later years, of course, when I went into academic study, because I realised that the Gaelic Bible that I was using in Ballymartin was linked into a form of Gaelic which was very much older than the 1950s and 1960s in Ballymartin. I found that I could access early modern and earlier Gaelic and Irish texts quite easily because I had a knowledge of the Gaelic Bible. And I found that very interesting. And it took me a while to discover why, and perhaps that's one of the great things about coming to university and studying in colleges like this, that they join the dots and you become much more familiar with why certain things as they are as they are. Now, I'm going to try to position the Gaelic Bible texts for you so that you have a broad outline in your minds and in your heads of how things came to be as they are. And to that end, I am using a diagram which I hope you will find useful. I tried to work out this diagram. It's a first stab at representing, I suppose, the linguistic complexion of Gaelic Bibles through the centuries. The Scottish Gaelic Bible, with which most people are familiar, can be seen here, marked very beautifully in red, mainly red, between 1767 and 1801, when the main job of producing the Bible, the New Testament and then the Old Testament, in a form of Gaelic closer to spoken Scottish Gaelic, was undertaken. And most people know about that Gaelic Bible. It's the one that's still used down to the present day, although translation of the Bible into Gaelic doesn't stop. I myself was involved in revision of the standard Gaelic Bible, the 1767-1801 Bible, when I revised the spelling of that work for the National Bible Society of Scotland in 1992. That was when it was published. I started in the mid-80s. I've also produced a diglot, Gaelic English New Testament, also with the National Bible Society of Scotland, as it then was called, and that was published in 2002, I think, 10 years after my revision. And new translations are continuing. Some of them are closer to the old text than others, and the process of Bible translation in Gaelic and modification doesn't stop. A New Testament in Scottish Gaelic, a new version of it, was published by the Scottish Bible Society in 2017-18. Now, as I've said, the Scottish Gaelic New Testament was published in 1767. Could we have the slide, please, for slide 3? That's it. Slide 3, the previous one, thank you. And it was aimed at speakers of Scottish Gaelic, as distinct from speakers of the sister language Irish or Irish Gaelic, as it is sometimes called. As you've seen, the translation of the Old Testament into Scottish Gaelic followed and was completed in 1801. My emphasis on Scottish Gaelic is important, as many people, even if they know nothing else about the history of the Gaelic Bible in Scotland, assume that the Gaelic people of this country had no Gaelic Bible or any part of the Gaelic Bible in their own language until the appearance of the New Testament in 1767. That's true in a sense, but it's only partly true and it is misleading. The Gaelic speakers of Scotland, or at least some of these speakers, had access to texts of the Bible in Gaelic by 1700, and the process of translation had been initiated over a century earlier than that. These Bible texts were shared with Ireland, and they were written in a form of Gaelic which was common to both countries. That form of Gaelic is sometimes called Classical Common Gaelic, which was essentially a written language used by the literary and literate classes. It could, of course, pass into the spoken languages through oral transmission in tales and so on. So there was some degree of interaction between the classical side and the vernacular spoken side. If you look at your diagram, which I've handed out to you, you'll see arrows going in opposite directions in an attempt to indicate that. But by and large, the Gaelic texts before 1767 were not translated into the ordinary spoken language of the people. That is the crucial thing to understand. So you required intermediaries. Now, if you look at the diagram again, you see that classical tradition. And as I talk about the Bibles, you'll be able to pick them up. The other texts too, some of them more blue, the basic ones in blue, and then the vernacular spoken Gaelic ones coming in later, represented here in red. Between the people speaking their vernacular language, their different dialects, and the classical tradition stood the ministers. And they were interpreters between the people and the Bibles. And it meant that you had a very learned school of ministers who knew the classical language. Basically, if you were going to write a text prior to 1700 in Gaelic, whether you were in Ireland or in Scotland, you would be using this classical language. That would be what you would do naturally. You wouldn't think of writing it in the spoken language. You would write it in the literary language. And that explains why the Bibles started off in that way and continued, if you follow on the graph, continued well to broadly 1700. And after that, gradually, the spoken word was taking over more strongly, so that you had to modify the later texts towards the spoken language. Is that clear now? Have I made my point? Any questions out of that? No? Quite sensible and comprehensible. Good. Well, that'll solve a problem or two then. Let's start with the first book ever to be printed in Gaelic in Ireland or Scotland. That was in 1567, and you can see it on the diagram here very clearly. John Carswell's translation of the Book of Common Order. Now, this was a fundamentally important text for Gaelic, and indeed for the Gaelic world more widely. Carswell made a translation with many modifications of the Book of Common Order. He specially fitted it into the Gaelic world of his own day, and he used classical Gaelic in the process. This was a directory book, and it put the emphasis, as the later church was to do, on the creation of liturgical, catechetical, and service books for the use of the Reformed Church in the Highlands and Islands. And you will hear more about the catechisms from Domhnall Uilleam. That's his area today. Among Carswell's additions to Knox's Book of Common Order was an epistle to the reader, a rather splendid introduction to what he had in mind. Carswell was the superintendent of the post-Reformation church in Argyll, very much a protege of the 3rd Earl of Argyll, and he dedicated the book to him. But he was also acutely aware of the reader presumably being a minister as learned as himself. This man, Carswell, had been trained at St Andrews University. He'd also attended apparently a bardic school, and the poets used this classical form of Gaelic. So he's a very learned man. And I presume that he was writing for the benefit of Reformation clergymen who, like himself, would have been priests before 1560 and would probably have been literate in Gaelic. So he used the classical language right away. And he also used Roman font. It's the letters that we're familiar with today if we look at any book or so on. That was what Carswell used in 1567. There was another font, a typeface, which was Gaelic script. And it was used, in spite of Carswell, it was used in these later classical Bibles that we'll be discussing later. Now, Carswell made it very clear in his epistle to the reader that he was aware of a huge gap in the provision for the Reformed Church, and that was the lack of a Gaelic Bible. He put his finger right on it, as in this text that's up there for you just now. He said that it was a great gap, a great lack that the Gaels of Ireland and Scotland had beyond others, beyond all others, that they didn't have a Bible in their own tongue. And he was aware that that was vitally important in promoting the Reformation. And I suspect that he expected it to happen fairly quickly. I can't imagine John Carswell would have envisaged that it was going to take 50 years, 60 years more to do this job. And he saw Ireland and Gaelic Scotland as constituting one cultural province and a Bible for both sets of Gaels, if you like. That was how he saw it. He himself had an interest in Bible translation. We know that because he translated little pieces of the Bible in the course of the book. For example, 1 Corinthians 3:11, no foundation has been laid other than Jesus Christ. And if you look at the text of that, you can see quite clearly that he's using the Vulgate. The vocabulary matches the Vulgate. So you have Carswell in 1567 beginning to translate from the Vulgate Latin text into classical Gaelic, where he is laying down precepts for marriage, for a marriage ceremony and so on. He again translates passages from the scriptures. And again, he's probably drawing on the Vulgate, or at least cross-referencing them, though I suspect they're already in the Book of Common Order. So the process of using Gaelic for scripture is well underway in Carswell's translation. He didn't do the translation of the Gaelic Bible. And what was to follow immediately after that in Gaelic Scotland was more on the catechetical side. It was more catechisms and so on. Now, people say to me, why was that? Why did they put catechisms ahead of the Bible? The same thing happened in Ireland. And my feeling about that is that they wanted to move the people over first and foremost in doctrine. That was priority number one, to create a reformed ecclesiastical society. And they gave priority to the catechisms and so on. That was important to them, and the Bible seemed to become later. Perhaps, as I say, there was an expectation that they would come fairly soon. But when the 17th century came, a very troubled period in the history of the Gaelic world, Ireland and Scotland emerged. And I have the greatest admiration for the people who translated the scriptures in such difficult circumstances. There were other things that were difficult too. For example, these were printed to be printed texts, and you had to find print, and you had to find the font to make it possible to print these texts. So you had many obstacles to overcome. You had to train your compositors to some extent so that they could handle Gaelic. And I'm amazed at how good Carswell's book is in terms of its print. It was printed in Edinburgh by Robert Lekprivik, who must have wondered what on earth he had there. And that was another challenge. However, gradually, slowly, these challenges were overcome. Carswell's book was used in Ireland. It was used to a certain extent in Scotland too. It kick-started the movement towards translating catechisms in Ireland and in Scotland, but it by no means brought into instant existence the translation of Bibles, but it was a huge catalyst. So there it is. That's how it began. Now, by the end of the 16th century, a New Testament was forming in Ireland. It was being undertaken by different individuals, ministers, priests, whatever you want to call them, who had again come in from the Roman Catholic side and were working through the Episcopal Church of Ireland. They were working often from Trinity College, Dublin. That was the home of so much. And there were two very important men who set things up. They weren't alone, though. The tendency is to give the ministers the pedestal and to forget that they're often using scribes and workers alongside them. And that was the case in Ireland. So here you have O'Donnell's New Testament of 16023. You can find it on the diagram, the graph that I've given you. Now, O'Donnell was a graduate. He was, I think, from the Tipperary side of Ireland, if I remember correctly. But he was also educated in England at a college called Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And I'm wearing the tie of Emmanuel College, Cambridge today. When O'Donnell, or Daniel, William Daniel, whatever you want to call them, went to Emmanuel College, it had just been set up. And there was a master there called Lawrence Chadderton. And Chadderton was one of the team who gave us what is called the authorized version in 1611. He had a particular interest in Bible translation. And Uilleam O'Donnell, who was later to become the Archbishop of Tuam in the west of Ireland, he became one of the translators of the Gaelic New Testament in classical Gaelic done in Ireland. It was interesting when I was a student at Emmanuel to reflect on the tradition of Emmanuel with regard to Gaelic, and to think that the spark that eventually gave us the Scottish Gaelic New Testament in 1767 and the Scottish Gaelic Old Testament in 1801 was actually lit in England in a Cambridge college, Emmanuel College. Very, very interesting. So you had by 1602-3, you had that. I've set them out there. There's Uilleam O'Donnell, sometimes called Daniel. He had a line of translators previously, including the previous Bishop of Tuam, Nehemiah Donnellan, and they all worked gradually, one taking over from the other until they had the full New Testament. So the New Testament was out first by 1623. Now that's not at all a bad achievement. They did it well, and it was some job getting the press. Queen Elizabeth I sent over typeface so that they could print the New Testament. That was how it was done. So even the famous Queen Elizabeth I has to be thanked for something here. Not always the most popular of people in Scotland, I believe, but she did help in her own way by sending over type. So we have Uilleam O'Donnell and we have his New Testament. And then we have a truly remarkable man, William Beadle, a Church of England clergyman, born in Essex. He'd spent time in different parts of Europe. He was a learned Hebrew scholar. He was a wonderful academic type. And he was educated too at, guess where? Holy Old College, try again, at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. He went on to be the provost, in effect the principal of Trinity College, Dublin, in 1627, and he learned Irish. So you had the Englishman learning Irish and getting on with a translation of the Old Testament into classical Gaelic. Remarkable. But he used others for the job. He had classical scribes, people who were used to writing classical Gaelic, doing the translation, the first drafts they worked on. And then he checked the whole text from Hebrew, translated it into Latin, so they say, checked it out, did his best to get it right. So he would go over the work of the scribes to see if they could sort it out. See if he could sort it out, make sure that it was as close to the Hebrew as could be. And that too was a remarkable achievement. But I've said before, this was a very troubled time, rebellions in Ireland against the English invaders and so on. And just as Beadle finished his translation, just about 1639, there was a huge rebellion. And his house in Kilmore was set on fire. And the manuscript of the Old Testament was rescued from the flames. It was as close as that. And it was kept by his successors until eventually the manuscript was edited for the press and was finally printed and published in London in 1685 by Robert Everingham. Everingham also produced a reprint of the New Testament in 1681. Both of these texts were later used in Scotland. So let's go slides 8, 9. There you have, previously, just go back one. Thank you. The New Testament, there it is. Cymrag nuag ar tierna. Agus ar slanier eus a Christ. Yn daring, gweinman lekish go Gaelic. Ri Uilleam O'Donnell. And that's the 1681 printing, the title page of that. What did it look like in print? Next slide. There it is. This is the episode where Jesus turns the water into wine. And if you look at that, it's written in the scribal hand of the classical period, and it's got all its contractions and scribal marks and so on. And that wasn't always the easiest to decode. Slide 9. Now here's William Beadle, and that's the stained glass window in the chapel of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, to Beadle. And when I was there, used to give him a wee wave, and I'm sure he liked that. But I thought that was a rather lovely portrayal of William Beadle. He certainly deserved his stained glass window, and I think there should be one somewhere in a church in Scotland as well. Next slide. Now you can still see the original manuscripts or pretty near them. If you go to Bishop Marsh's library in Dublin, you can still see these manuscripts. I went some years ago, and it was quite something to go to see these manuscripts of the Old Testament and to think about what they actually meant. This was the beginning of a long tradition. Domhnall got there first with the New Testament, but this was so fundamental to the creation of Bible texts in Gaelic. All the canonical books of the Old Testament, obviously as transcription, but it does say his original copy. Well, not quite sure if this was the one that was handed out through the flames, but it's certainly a fairly near representative of that tradition. On we go again. Next slide, please. There it goes. That's what it looks like. And various editors were at work on it, modifying it, trying to reshape some of the Irish, just to make it a wee bit more modern. This kind of tinkering was going on along the way, correcting it here and there. And a succession of editors, including a very famous one called Dr. Andrew Sall, again, a convert from Roman Catholicism, who was very busy, particularly in the later 17th century, trying to get this book into print. On we go. Any other slides? And here it is in print. Here are the books of the Old Testaments after they're being taken in Haring Gaelic. I can't entirely read it, but they've been brought from Hebrew or whatever by Uilleam Stewart. And that's his book, eventually published in 1685. Next again. There's the text. Now you see the fancy printing. That's Gaelic script. You would find it difficult today, unless you happen to know it, as we do through our Gaelic studies. But that was what your ministers were dealing with later on. Okay. Next example. See it there. That's very clear. So that was what your Gaelic Bible would have looked like at the end of the 17th century. And I do have copies here if you want to try your reading skills on them. I've just got a few copies there in photocopy that you can see. I think that's the last of these ones. Yes, we'll come to that in a wee minute. Now, this was a very troubled time in the 17th century. With Domhnall, particularly Biddle, worked in a very disturbed political context. But what about Gaelic Scotland? What was happening then? Was there anything doing in Gaelic Scotland? Well, the Synod of Argyll is very important because it had begun a project to translate the Bible in 1657, but it was never completed, although it was said that the manuscript text of the Gaelic Old Testament had been produced by the 1670s and was still around 1690s. I think it was. And we haven't been able to find that text, so I'm hoping that Domhnall Uilleam, in the course of his prowling around the sort of recondite corners of Scottish libraries, will someday find the Gaelic Old Testament that was produced by the Synod of Argyll. So they tell us. But what they did do was to produce Gaelic psalms, the Psalter. Somehow or other, they managed to get their ministers together to do the Gaelic Psalter. And that was a tremendous achievement. In 1659, I think that's the date, they managed to produce first 50 psalms in metre so that they could be sung. And then there was a gap because there was competitive tendering to get a full Gaelic Psalter. And this is where a fellow called Robert Kirk comes in. He managed to beat them to it with a full translation of the metrical psalms in 1684. Robert Kirk of Aberfoyle. Now, this translation was based, the Synod of Argyll translation, on classical Gaelic. And believe it or not, since then, Highland people have been singing classical Gaelic in their metrical psalter, adjusted somewhat to the spoken language. When I revised the Bible in 1992, I was amazed at how beautiful the Gaelic Psalms were in translation. And I saw very clearly how classical Gaelic had come to the assistance of the translators by giving all sorts of little words that could be slotted in to keep the meter. Very clever. And I don't think if they'd been working principally in modern Gaelic, spoken Gaelic, they could have done it as neatly. Now, there have been lots of revisions of that Psalter, and it's a story in itself, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. I'm just giving you an overview today. But what it does show you is that if times had been a little more settled, I'm quite sure that Gaelic Scotland could have produced its own Gaelic Bible by 1700. It was unfortunate that it didn't happen. But the Synod of Argyll, and of course I'm very fond of the Synod of Argyll for obvious reasons, they'd done a great job. And Domhnall Uilleam will have, I'm sure, a lot more to say about the Synod. Anything you want to pop in here, Domhnall Uilleam?
Just to say that Kirk's Psalms are a very, very interesting translation. And the Synod of Argyll did have a copy of Kirk's Psalms, and clearly they were copying off Kirk as well when they were putting their own psalter together. And poor old Kirk he didn't get credit for that at all.
No.
And the Synod of Argyll went so far as when they got their psalter printed in 1694, they sent a box of the psalters deliberately to Kirk's old parish. They were thumbing their nose up at Kirk and the people 3 years. We're the bosses now.
It's so interesting, that period. The competition to translate the Psalms into Gaelic. Who would think about of it? And Kirk, we'll come to him later a wee bit, he was so defensive of his own work, he got a patent or a privilege of how many years, so that his book had to be used. Oh, that was the good old days, folks. And everyone was so nice. So what were you going to do here? Well, let's see slides 14, 15, 16 first. Here we've got the Psalms, the title page of the first 50 of the Psalms by the Synod of Argyll. Next one. And here's the 1694 complete set. And in between, you've got this rascal Robert Kirk, an absolutely brilliant man, the Episcopal incumbent of Aberfoyle, producing his own. We'll come to that later. Another slide, is there something else? Right, this is so interesting. Now, what did you do if you couldn't get a Bible? Well, you used other people's. There were the classical Gaelic Bible texts produced in Ireland, weren't there? So they were taken, some of them, about 207, is that right? Is that right? Yes, I think it is. Were brought over of the Old Testament. And how many of the New Testament? There weren't so many. I think there were less than probably half of that number brought to Scotland for the use of ministers, and they were distributed very slowly in Scotland. Now, how did this come about? It happened mainly because an Episcopal minister, the Reverend James Kirkwood, a native of Dunbar, had got in touch with a major supporter of these translations, namely the Honourable Robert Boyle. Who knows about Robert Boyle? Did anybody do chemistry? Now, this is the same man as Boyle's Law, folks. He got in touch with the Honourable Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle was the moneybags. He was the man who funded these Bibles, being printed in London. He funded the whole thing. And then he made it possible for additional copies from the printers to come to Gaelic Scotland. the father of modern chemistry, was the father of modern Gaelic Bibles in Scotland. It's very interesting. He funded the printing and publishing of O'Donnell's New Testament in 1681 and also Beadle's Old Testament in 1685, and then arranged for copies to come to Scotland. Amazing. And you can still see some of them in position in the churches in Scotland. There's a set in Rothsay, and here's the presentation plate. Just go back to that one. The donation of the Honourable, Pious, come on, read it, you're better at it than I have. The donation of the Honourable Pious and Learned Robert Boyle, son to the Earl of Cork, etc., in Ireland, a principal member of the Royal Society, bestowed on the parish church of Rothsay to continue there as the church Bible for the present Reverend Minister, Master John Munro, his use, and for the behoof of all the ministers who shall succeed in that parish. And the Bibles are still there. And they weren't published, they weren't distributed throughout the whole of Scotland, mainly Argyll and Rothshire. Rothshire got a lot of them, right? So the Bibles came from Ireland and they were used, and ministers had to act as intermediaries, right? Now, from a Scottish perspective, the main problem with these texts was not their language, because the ministers could interpret that, but it's the style of the typeface. Remember, you saw the fancy type, right? Got that picture. Now, this challenge of changing the typeface from Gaelic to Roman was undertaken by Robert Kirk, who was successively the Episcopal minister of Balquhidder and Aberfoyle. Kirk was a speaker of Aberfoyle Gaelic. Have you ever heard Aberfoyle Gaelic? Well, that was part of West Perthshire Gaelic at one time. And he taught himself the classical language so that he could handle all these Bibles, probably learned on the job. He then must have spent days, nights, burnt the midnight oil ferociously, actually writing out the Bibles in Roman script and taking them to the stage of print. His Bible, a wee pocket Bible, a wee beauty. I wish I had a copy of it. If any of you know where there's a copy of Kirk's Bible, then please get in touch and I'll give you, well, I wouldn't like to say how much, because my extravagance in that field might get to somebody else's ears. So, but it's such a beautiful little text, a pocket Bible. And that Bible in Roman font became pretty well the standard Gaelic Bible. Well, Uilleam, any comments on this remarkable Robert Kirk? You've been working on him recently, I believe.
Well, all I can say is that there's if you go to the Gaelic Society of Inverness library, they've got a copy of the Irish text from 1685. And part of it must have fallen out when it was being bound. And there was a minister who owned that Bible who transliterated everything which was missed out from another Bible into, onto manuscript. Now it's bound in with the rest of it. And he didn't use Irish script, he used Roman script. So you've got the printed stuff is the Irish script. And then the manuscript, which is a big chunk of the Bible, is in Roman script or secretary hand. And then it goes back to the Irish printing stuff again. Yeah. So it's a huge, big chunk of Gaelic writing from then.
Which is presumably what Kirk actually did as well.
I presume so, but he must have been kicking himself when the Kirk Bible came out 5 years later. Yeah.
So are you suggesting there was a rival copy around?
No, it was a piece with a few books of the Bible missing.
Yes.
And so what the minister did was he wrote it all out himself from another copy and transliterated it.
Wonderful.
So there's
quite a story. People, ministers particularly, acting as Latimers, interpreters, very learnedly. And the people became very used to that kind of oral Bible, which came from a manuscripts from the printed
Yeah.
Irish ones. That's it. And they became so used to these Bibles that they did like the other ones when they turned up. It's the usual thing. You know, oh, that translation. Yeah, it's not as good as the old one. You know, but that did the rounds as well. So we've had, what slide are we on now? Here we are. We're coming to Robert Kirk. Just a wee summary of this extraordinary guy. Published the first complete translation of the Gaelic metrical Psalms, Edinburgh 1684. Transliterated classical Gaelic Old and New Testaments, Beadle and Dawn into Roman font. Expanded scribal abbreviations for use in Scotland. Added subheadings and corrected parts of texts. Whew. The whole lot. I stand in awe. Kirk's Bible, printed and published as a pocket Bible by Robert Everingham in London, 1690. Now, this was Robert Everingham who did the other printings. He did the earlier Bibles as well. And Kirk was the supervisory editor, checking all of that too. Oh, what a man. And I've said there, an outstanding achievement, wouldn't you agree? Terrific. And this became the Bible. Now, there were difficulties in distributing it, partly because the church, the established church and the Edinburgh sect really weren't keen on promoting Gaelic. And the fear was that if you gave them a Gaelic Bible, these wild barbarians in Rothshire and wherever, you know, you're perpetuating the language. Now, remember, these ministers were going against the flow of the time in that respect. They were fighting the authorities to get these Bibles done. And I admire them for that. It wasn't an easy task. So if you think to yourself, well, why were they so slow? The miracle is that we've got Gaelic Bibles at all, given that the times were so troubled and difficult. So here's Kirk. We've reached Kirk. Now, Kirk's Bible became the thing, and some people, they wouldn't hear of another Bible except Kirk's. But another Bible was on its way. And so by this period, the end of the 17th century, you had Kirk's Bible, and then you were into another era where the balance tipped very, very clearly towards the spoken and vernacular language. Part of the reason for this was the setting up of a society which we all love to condemn, the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, known as the SSPCK. And the SSPCK has become the whipping boy of why there wasn't a Gaelic Bible sooner in Scotland. Well, actually, it was the SSPCK that funded and looked after the making of the Gaelic Bible. Why? Because they were trying to, well, yes, eradicate Gaelic, teach through the medium of English from the establishment of the society in 1709 onwards. But they discovered that things weren't going quite as well as they'd have liked, and it was very hard to teach people through the medium of a language, English, which they didn't understand. So the thinking was, well, if we do it in Gaelic, we'll move them over to literacy and to proper manners more quickly. So eventually it decided by about 1750 that a Gaelic Bible was the way to proceed, a new one which was closer to the spoken language. The work was assigned, first of all, to the Reverend Alexander MacFarlane, who was the minister of Arachart, and he got it about 1755, but he wasn't able to make any significant progress. Then one day, a school teacher turned up, a man called Dougal Buchanan. He wrote to the SSPCK and said, I'll help the Reverend Alexander MacFarlane. And he presented the SSPCK with a translation of the second epistle of Peter, just like that. Well, he was a great translator. He was a Gaelic poet, composer, translator of hymns too, translated the hymns of Isaac Watts into Gaelic. We now call them the hymns of Dougal Buchanan, of course, but actually they belong to Isaac Watts originally, and this was the period of translation, you see. moving between cultures, right? And the job was assigned after that to the Reverend James Stewart, Minister of Killin. Slides 22, 23. Here's Kirk's Bible. You see, that's much more easily read. You see it there. And he points out this is for the general good of the Gaels of Scotland. That's Kirk's little one. Lovely thing. You can see I've translated it into on that side. For the general good of the Gaels of Scotland, it's now been altered carefully from the Irish letter to the small legible Roman letter, with tables also explaining the most difficult words. And these Bibles often had glossaries in them. On we go. There's the significance and influence of Kirk's Bible before we leave it. Became the Gaelic Bible in Scotland until the early 19th century. It perpetuated the use of classical Gaelic forms. You can see it in the Gaelic hymns of Dougal Buchanan. It wasn't a vernacular Scottish Gaelic Bible, but the ministers again interpreted it. Now on to the next set. Here's James Stewart of Killin, and he's said to be there, Ciat Iter Hengar in Jimini Noai, the first translator of the New Testament. Not true. But never mind, it's on a monument, so it must be true. On again. The translation was assigned by the SSPCK, there it is summarising what I've said, to the Reverend Alexander MacFarlane Aracher, then reassigned to James Stewart in Killin, and the translation was revised before printing by the Reverend James Fraser Alness. But it's clear that the SSPCK teacher, Dougal Buchanan, was the first to translate any part of this proposed New Testament into Scottish Gaelic. Well done, though. And Buchanan supervised the printing of this vernacular Bible in Edinburgh. So there you have most of that story. But just to run quickly through these slides here. Domhnall Uilleam Stewart, who's forever going into these recondite corners of dark libraries and finding treasure, found pages showing how the Gaelic New Testament was being altered, adjusted prior to going to the printing press. And you can see this being altered, pages of the Book of Acts being altered with an editorial hand. If we just run through these very quickly, Rob. There we are. There are a couple of ones for the Acts of the Apostles. On we go. And then there's one of the epistles, Corinthians, is it? Being adjusted. You can see the editorial marks. And we know this is the New Testament that we have today, the Standard New Testament, because in the first edition, these emendations have been taken into account. Domhnall Uilleam, this is your discovery. Tell us.
Well, I've got nothing more to say apart from it's lurking in the. It's a collection of the Reverend the Reverend John Stewart's, his sons, all his papers in Edinburgh University Library. It was catalogued by Dr. Anne Frater in Lewis when she was down in Edinburgh, but it was just a handwritten catalogue. So as soon as I found it, I went in behind the scenes to the strong room, and it's full of poetry which he had collected, and it's got a huge amount of grammar, Gaelic grammar, because he was trying to put together a Gaelic grammar. And there's also this stuff, as well as the sermons. And he must have kept some of these just as keepsakes possibly from his father's work. And it was found, as far as you can see, it was found in a bookstore in Dublin sometime in the late 1800s. So we don't know what it was doing between then. Yeah, it's a fantastic collection.
There you are.
Of stuff.
So you're seeing these actually probably for the first time. The first time ever you're being shown pages of the Gaelic New Testament, which we all know so well if we've been brought up in that tradition. Pages of that New Testament being corrected prior to going to the printing press. Who was the corrector? Well, it's quite possible it was the Reverend James Fraser of Alness. So if any of you want to research James Fraser of Alness and send me a learned note about him, we'll be very happy. I certainly will be to know more about him. The Frasers, I think they were Frasers of Kirkhill as well.
Were they?
Same lot. So anyone who wants to explore that can do so. Right. So have we gone through that? That's the last one. There we go. Onwards again. And then the New Testament appeared in print in 1767, supervised by Dougal Buchanan. Why was he supervising it? I've often asked myself that. Well, here's my answer. I think he was responsible for writing, translating a fair amount of it. And there was nobody around who knew the New Testament better than Dougal Buchanan, the schoolmaster of Kinlochranach. Brilliant man. Anyway, on we go. And then the Old Testament, that was a much slower job. It was translated in 4 volumes between 1780 and 1801 by different translators, among them the Reverend John Stewart of Luss, the Reverend John Smith of Campbelltown, James MacLagan, a major collector of Gaelic songs, poems, huge figure in Gaelic Scotland, and the Reverend Donald McQueen, Kilmuir, Skye. So it was a corporate job and 4 volumes. But it had to be revised. And there's more research for a beaver here. John Smith's volume, The Prophets, had to be revised substantially because of its free approach to translation. And the revision was undertaken by the Reverend Alexander Stewart Dingwall. He was Stewart of Moulin earlier, Reverend Alexander Stewart. Now, what had happened here, and here I'm coming to an end, you'll be glad to know. What happened? Well, John Smith was an expert in the latest commentaries on the Old Testament. He knew the work of Bishop Louth, and there were others as well, Jamie, around that period, who were working on the Old Testament with various theories of poetic translation. And it was precisely that style that John Smith actually used. And it caused a flap when others saw it, because it was so out of sync with the other volumes. And the other volumes were sort of being governed to a large extent by the tones and cadences and style of the English authorized version. So there's a discrepancy. For example, when Smith was translating the verse about they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up on wings as eagles, he translated it along the lines of, they will begin to sprout feathers like the eagles. And Stewart put a red line through that and brought it into a form of translation much closer to the authorized version. So 1807, and then you had the main Gaelic Bible. Any other slides we can run through fast? There it is, just click, click, click. The Old Testament, the advertisement for it. I've got these texts actually. I'm very proud to be the owner of the Old Testament volumes, the originals. On they go, spin through, and that's it. And here's the Reverend John Stewart, son of James Stewart. This is said to be a picture of him at work. He revised the 2nd edition of his father's, well, the translation fathered on his father. I'm not sure if he did it or not, but if you're a minister, you had prestige and you got the name, and all the other wee scribes, well, forget about them. So he revised that, and he was the translator of Volume 3 of the Old Testament. And sad to say, he was very slow. And the SSPCK said, hurry up, Miss Master Stewart, we must get this project finished sometime. And in 1801, he produced Volume 3, and that was it. And then, of course, there was a later revision. Right, recap. Stages of Gaelic Bible translation, 1600, 1700, Gaelic text translated into late classical Gaelic in Ireland and printed in Gaelic insular font. 1657, 1670, Synod of Argyll at work on translation of the Old Testament into Gaelic, work disrupted by restoration, 1660, manuscripts lost. Then 1680, 1690, sharing of classical Gaelic texts with Scotland and alteration of Gaelic font to Roman font. Kirk's Bible of 1690 was the classic, all funded by Robert Boyle. And then there was the translation of Gaelic biblical texts specifically for Gaelic Scotland, 1750 to 1807. And so the good work begins, and at that point I finish, and hope you enjoyed that quick overview of how Scotland got its first Gaelic Bibles. More an pan gehaarsten, Sinead, Uilleam, that's the thing.
Okay, I think we'll maybe try and restart. Keep the kettle boiling, keep the pressure up. Those online, I hope you're hearing us okay. Thanks for your patience earlier on. Just as we reconvene, maybe just take this opportunity as Domhnall Uilleam finds his PowerPoint and all that kind of thing. I will just introduce him. He was speaking to us on Gaelic Catechisms. As you probably know, he was educated various places, including Magdalen College, Oxford. His doctoral dissertation, which I'm reading off the website here, was the first doctoral dissertation to be written in Scottish Gaelic.
I've been telling you all this.
public, so common knowledge.
My dark secrets.
Yeah. He examined the 17th century Scottish Highlands culture and history, literature. So that's your PhD in Edinburgh. You've been working since then on Alexander Carmichael.
Oh yes.
Famous Carmina Gadelica
with Donald.
With Donald. That was a conjunction and that kind of happy time a couple of decades ago, getting on for that. And also somebody who rejoices in the name of Martin.
Aye, yes.
And I thought that was maybe a mistake. Maybe I thought I'd written that down wrongly. And then I thought, no, his name is Martin.
Oh, it's haplography.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Very good. Who's a week from an earlier time, from 1665 to 1718, are his dates. You've also done a bit on Ossian and Macpherson.
Aye, you can't avoid him. Yes.
Part of that revisionist thing to actually make the guy seem like a hero rather than a villain.
No, he was a terrible man.
Okay, well, we haven't quite got there yet. We haven't made a saint of him just yet. Oh well, okay, we can talk more about that. We've also published a couple of things which look very interesting. A history of the Gaels, like a long durée thing from 1550s. Is that? I only played the Gaelic version of that. Is it an English version?
No, it's a Gaelic.
Just Gaelic. Yes. Okay, right, interesting. And also, you edited a book called The Life and Legacy of Carmichael, which looked very interesting.
Yes,
look at that online. Anyway, I'll shut up. Let you go.
No,
on.
let's go for
Thanks
it.
very much.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much, and thanks very much for everybody for being here. And I'll just repeat what Donald has said. Just thanks for the Highland Theological College for being so kind to us, for inviting us over, and for looking after us so well as well. So thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me online, and let's see if this works. If you're hard of seeing, come a bit closer to the screen, because I'll be using some text, but we'll see how far we get in this as well, because I know time is running out, and
We've got an hour at least.
We've got an hour at least. Maybe we need another hour after that as well. There's a lot of slides, but I'll try to get through it. I'm speaking, as you can see, without any notes or anything, so we'll see how that goes as well. Can you get rid of all the pictures as well on the other side? Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Right, here we are. So this is the shorter catechism. I'm sure it will bring back a few awful memories to people in here. I very, very, very quickly, I was asked by Dagmar and Eleanor in Bonn to contribute a chapter to a book which is just about to come out on European, in fact, worldwide catechism translations. So I did the Gaelic one. It was supposed to be, I think, 7,000 words at the most, and I've got 15,000 word chapter. It's an awful lot to say about it, and that was only 10 years I was working on. So I'll give you basically what I said in this chapter, but one or two other things as well, which are thoughts have come to me since I did this, the chapter. So thanks very much to the editors in Bonn for putting up with me and putting up with all the stuff, the additions and the amendments I was putting in. So this is what, if we have time, this is what we'll look at. Catechisms in general, the Catechism in Scottish Life, the Gaelic Shorter Catechism translation, the Shorter Catechism is use. Then we'll look at the second edition from 1659. That's the first version which we have. We don't have the first edition of the Gaelic Shorter Catechism. We do have the second one, but we know that the second edition is slightly different from the first edition. So we're looking at why that was the case, how it was adapted, why it was adapted, and then maybe if we've got time, we're looking at questions about what might have been as well, following on what Donald said, the other Donald said earlier on. So, Koyu, what is a catechism? As you can see there, it's a series of questions and answers on fundamental principles of the church's faith. You memorize the questions so you can recite the answer when they're asked by the teacher, who is known as the catechist. And we have various catechism used in various traditions of the Christian church worldwide, but they're all aiming to ensure that the basic principles, the fundamental principles of the faith, are made clear and they're spread among the readers and their hearers. As we've had already today, I'm sorry about this. I've tried to make the font as big as possible to those here, but contemporary scholars are very interested about catechisms. People are interested in the notion of translation because of the challenge which catechisms give to the translators. So you've all got to follow the same sort of genre, the pattern of question and response. And because they're teaching principles of the Christian faith, the translations have to adhere very closely and carefully and precisely to the essential meaning. At the same time, however, there has to be a certain degree of freedom so that the teaching can be understood and memorized, often by children in other cultures. And these people may have very different religious and philosophical perspectives concerning matter of religion. So obviously, translators, scholars of translation are also very, very interested in the notion of translating catechism. Questions there: how do we explain baptism to people who belong to a very, very different culture? Notions of communion, of sacrament, of sin itself, the concept of a creator, even the idea of religion in general. And how can we create the logical thought which is behind these concepts? Do we create new words and phrases, or do we transliterate them, maybe from Latin or English? Or do we use words and phrases which are already present in that culture, but we give them a different meaning? Are you all with me for this? It's very, very interesting, all these questions which come. So all sorts of different catechisms, including, as you can see there in the bottom left, a Mesoamerican visual catechism as well. Catechism in different scripts, in writing and print, very different ways in which the genre has been treated over the centuries. But this is the one which we'll be looking at today. This is the Shorter Catechism, the Westminster Standard Shorter Catechism, first published in 1648. We're looking at the Gaelic translation of this very influential little book. And here's the second edition that I was talking about, 1659, Forcetal Ahir Heishnaye, the short treatise of questions, which was remade and rebranded towards the end of the 1700s as Lior Ahir Ningesh, the short book of questions, of the questions. And it was even branded, as you can see, as Thomas MacLachlan's version that was branded according to different ministers as well when it was transformed into Lior Ahir Ningesh. There's a whole genre in European art of catechists going about their business. As you can see, different ways, different people telling the catechism. The catechism is very, very important especially in Scotland, because unless you have the catechism, at least some question and answers on your tongue, in your memory, you're not able to marry, you're not able to baptize your child, you're not able to take communion with the church. It is absolutely crucial that you know your catechism to be able to participate in the life of the community as far as the church is concerned. So here's a poor woman. She has, before she can marry, she has to know a bit of, at least a bit of the catechism. So here she is being questioned by the local minister. There, it's a lovely genre painting that. And again, and this is the Westminster Assembly in the 1640s when the catechism was shaped, the shorter catechism. It's the Westminster Assembly. It's mainly in English, mainly English clergy and theologians. There were some Scots there who played very influential role. But this is the quid pro quo in turn for Scots military assistance against royalist forces. The idea was that Presbyterianism was going to replace Episcopalianism across these islands in England, Wales and Ireland, as well as Scotland, and there'd be doctrinal and liturgical uniformity across the established churches in Britain. It's a very, very important meeting. Principle of religious tolerance in 1647 meant that you didn't have a national Presbyterian church in England, but as you can see, the Church of Scotland formally adopted the texts which came out of this assembly as its doctrinal standards. So very, very important. Here you are. They began with the Confession of Faith, which up until the 1930s at least, ministers were expected to sign in the Church of Scotland. You expect to put your name to the principles of faith in the Confession of Faith. Out of that was distilled the larger catechism, which was mainly aimed at theological scholars, I believe. And then out of that, there's a popular version, the shorter catechism, 107 questions aimed at everybody in Scotland. The entire Scottish population was meant to memorize the shorter catechism. But is that all right? That's so far so good. And I'm more or less accurate historically with that as well. Yes. So you can see the sort of distillation process going on, ending in the shorter catechism. Now, the short catechism, as most people in this room will know, remained a pervasive means of instruction in Scottish schoolrooms and Sunday schools, at least until the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly right through most of the 20th century in Lewis, among other places, taught in the schoolroom, in primary schools, as well as in Sabbath schools and Sunday schools. Here is somebody that Donald Meek knows well, the Reverend Thomas Murchison, and he called it Liora Nicaro Barok Buai na Lior se be elle a machan people hain, a biachkan is base and sloten halapu suas gusilyan shahin. A small book which exerted greater influence than any other book except the Bible itself upon the beliefs and manners of the people of Scotland until this century, until the 20th century. So it's a very, very, very important little text in our history. So children would learn their questions from catechists, school teachers and parents. Some acquaintance with its principles was obligatory, as I said. You couldn't have your child baptized, you couldn't marry in church, and you couldn't take part in Holy Communion unless you knew at least part of your catechism. But the catechism isn't a pastoral manual. It's not child-friendly, as you know, as many of us know. It is a distillation of the systematic and comprehensive theological exposition laid out in the Confession of Faith. It's a summa of Presbyterian doctrine as elaborated through the dense analytical frameworks of 80 years of rational Reformed scholasticism. It gives you a headache going through all of these 107 questions. So it's carefully structured, systematically ordered. It is intellectually demanding method of internalizing 17th century Reformed theology. The double distilled Presbyterian spirit out of it, however, turned out to be more than most young children were able to swallow. So even when it came out first, the General Assembly took one look at it and said,
well, this is supposedly for the capacity of the common and unlearned, but it's too long and too high for our common people and children. And it proposed to have a shorter and clearer version drawn up. And over the years, over the decades, you had a series of, if you like, introductions to the shorter catechism. You had the Sum of Saving Grace, you had the Mother's Catechism, and you had a whole host of other shorter catechisms as an introduction to the Ora Hiarnancation, the shorter catechism there. Also, it's very important to remember, even if you've memorized the question, that is no guarantee that you understand anything about what is actually in the question, what the question means. So here again is a cherished joch, Reverend Domhnall Uilleam. I had to have him in, Minister of Blairathal. Here he is. What is justification? Garish at the record, Holoas ho Yulakach. She had the Vigat to go al Aurain. A Haruparok Suimach, Gan Prian. Na take you kid about the Kyoloch. Chef Navigat Naroat Nyaura. Hutje can I grow kind of a Hushlichat, this Hushlichat, the Risha the East, Scuring through I got Granade Olish. Allah Kai. Hacher Gaif Mara Hacher and Halamater. Hichat and Glaper Kriya. They fell in the mud and the mire. Now, we've got to think about that, the embarrassment of standing up in front of everybody, whether it's in the school or whether it's in the church, and trying to recite these very complex pieces. Here it is here, the justification question that the Reverend Domhnall Uilleam imagine well, I can't make sense. Imagine a 10-year-old having to remember to memorize this in Gaelic or for that matter in English. So it's not just a question of the challenge of having to learn this very dense theological exposition, it's of having to recite it in front of an audience. It's no wonder people have this anxiety, which I still remember, of trying to remember all this stuff. So let's go back to the Synod of Argyll. They had a challenge in translating the shorter catechism into Gaelic, because they had to keep with doctrine. The doctrine had to be accurate. The doctrine, there was no room for flexible adaptation. They had to give the doctrine as it was in the English. But then again, you have the issue of linguistic appropriateness. The text has to be high enough so it looks official, so it is suitable to impart Christian doctrine. But at the same time, it has to be accessible enough that the congregation can memorize it. And as we've heard from Donald, the standard high level of classical Gaelic, the bardic language, the language of the learned orders, this appears to it was challenging to Scottish Gaelic speakers. But at the same time, as we've heard from Donald, there was no standard written vernacular Gaelic. I'd go so far as there wasn't such a thing as Scottish Gaelic during this period. There was Gaelic in Scotland, but there wasn't Scottish Gaelic. So there was no discourse tradition. There was no a codified meta language of logic with which to structure this. There was no widely recognized language, if you like, language of the Bible in Gaelic, which was suitable in which to translate the shorter catechism. So the poor Synod of Argyll had problems, and to make it worse, it wasn't to be used in schools. It was only in oral questioning, oral catechizing, not through books. And this is a very famous play at one time. This is the child Rab is saying, "I don't understand what it means, the catechism." And his father says, "Who's expecting you to understand it? Learn it." So this is that's exactly Scottish education. It's so interesting that the way the catechism is actually, it is absolutely, hashing through we're saturated. All this Scottish Enlightenment stuff, it was done by people that had learned the catechism. Now, how was it translated then? All these problems. I'm drawing, when I was doing this first, I was drawing in Ronald Black's article, A Handless of Gaelic Printed Books. Is wonderful for that. And I remember saying to Ronnie, thanks so much for going through all the catechisms. And there's, about 30 different editions of it. As you can, 39 editions of it. And that's just up to 1800 of the catechism. It was a book which was read and which was used. And when I gave the talk in the University of Bonn 2 years ago, I tried to go through all of the editions. And it was the worst paper I've ever given in my life. So in the end, when I did the article, I just did these two editions there. The first two, 1653, which I think was published in Edinburgh, but we don't have a copy left. And then 1659. Now, what I should say is books, especially small books, because we're dealing with they're little books, they're very thin. And I think, because they're being handled by children all the time, they'd be ripped into shreds anyway. And also, I think because of the damp climate of the Highlands means that books, especially little books like that, they tend to fall apart very, very quickly. And I think that's the reason why we don't have the first edition. The second edition and editions after that, they tend to be bound in with the Psalms. So it means they've got protection and it means they survive. But that first edition, there are no copies of it left. Now, I'm going to run very quickly through this because that's just looking at previous. We've read about Carswell. And let's just go straight to this Skeely Archie. Yes, became the Marquis of Argyll, and he was working with the Synod of Argyll. Let's say that. Who basically, as you can see, they're a quasi-autonomous church within the Church of Scotland under his patronage, and they had this ambitious translation program, which you've heard about already from Donald, going during the 1650s, translate the Catechism, translate the Psalms, the metrical Psalms, translate, finally, the Old Testament as well. And this is where you can see it's bigger than just Argyll. It's the whole of the West Highlands, whole of the Hebrides was under the authority, notionally at least, of the Synod of Argyll. Now, we're very lucky because we've got the complete records of the Synod of Argyll from this period, and they've been printed by Duncan MacTavish for the Scottish History Society. Wonderful volumes. And we've also got, if you use Scotland's People, you'll know that you can go and look at the Kirk Session books and the Presbytery books as well. And we have some Kirk Session records and some Presbytery records as well for the if you like, the church courts which were working beneath the Synod of Argyll as well. And we'll be looking at these if we have time later on as well. So I've talked about the Westminster Assembly already. Here's a shorter catechism. What was going on just prior to the translation beginning? Well, civil war. Montrose and Alistair MacCulloch against the Marquis of Argyll, ripping the country apart. And there was an ideological side to this conflict, as we've heard from Donald, both sides trying to win the people over to their side rather than the other. Now, in the course of the 1640s, if you know your Gaelic literature, there's an awful lot, there's a big growth, or at least appears to be a big growth in songs composed in vernacular Scottish Gaelic. And Alan McInnes has called this the vernacular impulse. So there's all these songs composed by Ian Lowme and Echan Bachgoch, where they're praising Alistair MacCulloch, they're praising the Stuart Kings, and they're putting down on the Campbells, as we know only too well. And they're trying to address not just individual clans, but address the people of the Highlands as a whole. Now, at the same time as this is going on in Gaelic, in English, you've got this huge growth in newspapers and street ballads and cheap print in London and in Edinburgh during this period as well. And the two are analogous, they're comparable to each other. This growth in Scottish Gaelic song and the growth in English newspapers. And, it's all about news. It's all about winning people to your side. It's an ideological conflict. And we can see that, I think, in what the Synod of Argyll is doing. This is a vernacular impulse, but not at first through song, but it's through prose. It's through the catechism, and then eventually we get it's the Synod of Argyll's answer to Ian Loam, to Echan Baccoch. It's the Psalms, the congregation singing songs together and drowning out Ian Loam and Echan Baccoch. And they're also trying to set up a network of churches and of funded schools as well. They want to raise this new generation of young boys. No, young girls didn't get education in those days in the Highlands. Young boys, and these would be the Presbyterian elders and the ministers of the future. So they start off 1649. They've beaten Montrose, they've beaten Alistair McCullough, and they want to get the catechism, which has just newly come out in English, newly come out from the Westminster Assembly. They want to get it in Gaelic as soon as possible. So 7 ministers begin work on it. A year and a half later, they made no progress whatsoever. So they make 8 ministers to work on it, 2 from each presbytery. So they're putting pressure on people. Note the presbytery of Skye is not being involved. You know, a few months later, nobody is getting it done either. So 3 ministers have to remain in Inverera after the synod meeting. They're told to stay, and they're not allowed to leave Inverera until they finish the translation. And they get it done by, well, 2 ministers get it done by October 1651. The translation is at least last completed. And we can see what a challenge it must have been to translate this text. Even though it's short, it's very demanding. 2 ministers, Reverend Ewan Cameron, who is a member of a family of Cameron ministers in Cowell, probably related to the chief of the Camerons, on one hand, and this very interesting man, the Reverend Dougal Campbell, minister of Knapdale. Now, Dougal Campbell had a cousin over in Ulster who was a minister, a Presbyterian minister over there, who spoke Irish Gaelic. Now, he, as well as, and he probably learned, you know, classical. He was comfortable with the classical language, and also, I suspect, he would also have the Irish religious texts that you were talking about earlier. The Book of Common Prayer. He probably had the New Testament as well with him. The reason why I suspect that especially is because the Synod of Argyll were translating the Old Testament, and I think that means they already had copies of the New Testament in Irish. They probably had Uilleam Stewart translation there with him. So anyway, translation is completed. And so, yes, they were. Yes, absolutely, they were filling it. Thanks. We should have a conversation about this sometime. Thank you. But there's a problem, because they can't print it, because the Scottish lowlands at that time are occupied by an English invasion, by Cromwell's forces, so they couldn't get to a printing press. So what they did was they used the classical Gaelic poet Neil MacEoing as a photocopier, and they got him to transcribe 17 copies. He was an old man at the time of the book in the Irish character, and I think that means written in Irish script, which we've seen earlier. So that's Neil MacEoing. He transcribed 17 copies. Now, it's awfully funny, because when he finished these copies, they were spread all over the synod's lands. And we see that the Skye ministers don't like this translation. It's not in their dialect, and they're not pleased with that. So they put in their own text. They put in their own text, and poor old Neil MacEoing, the ministers who did the original translation, they must have been making mistakes in classical Irish. So he puts in his own text, written by a classical Irish bard, a classical bard trained in an Irish bardic school, correcting the Synod's Gaelic translation. So they're both dissenting remonstrances by those who are perhaps not very happy that they hadn't been consulted regarding the original translation. And so possibly at the bottom there, one final text was compiled, bringing together everybody's recommendations together to try to keep everybody happy. I don't know how happy they were, but that was the idea. And then eventually, Reverend Ewan Cameron, who we've met earlier, he gathered stipends in Lochaber, and these stipends paid for the printing, probably in Edinburgh, in May 1653, and it was printed and distributed, I think 2,000 copies among the ministers of the synod, but no copy of the 1653 edition of the Forkydal survives. All we have are the synod records for that. So I've done this basic family tree of the synod. You can see how complicated it is, of the various versions, and they've all got asterisks beside them because we haven't got them. They're just we just have records of them. All we have is the 1659 printed edition there. Now, how was it used? How are we doing with time? Are we okay just now? You don't need to go off to Tesco's or anything. Yeah, no, you're okay. So the synod strategy was that they would follow the General Assembly's recommendation. Every Sunday after the sermon, you had to stay in church afterwards and you had to memorize and recite 2 questions every week. And that way they'd go through, there was 107 questions in the Shorter Catechism. So it would take a year, as Calvin recommended in Geneva, to go through the entire book. But also you'd have these schoolboys, and the schoolboys would memorize the catechism, and they would go from house to house in their communities, catechizing the community. Now, this is from the Inverera English congregation, the Kirk Session records, and they weren't very happy about the idea of Highland lads going round from house to house. So the overture of the presbytery concerning the trial of some poor Highland, and do you see they've crossed out the word loons? That's L-O-O-N-S, loons, which means a clown or a scoundrel as well as a boy. Oh no, we can't call them loons. And I think they've begun saying lads there. There's L-A, I think, and they've crossed that out as well. And they went with boys to be sent up and down for reading the Irish Catechism to them. So the Douce boroughs, English-speaking boroughs of Inverera, aren't very pleased with the idea of Gaelic-speaking rascals going from house to house. So anyway, but nevertheless, it went on. Now, I think it's important to realize when you get a set text of a catechism printed, it means that you have to memorize it word for word. And I think in the old days, I mean, they were catechizing in the old days too, but they were catechizing face to face without a standard text. So it'd just be a bit of a conversation, the minister would help the congregants, show that they knew at least the basics of the Reformed faith. It may have been more like a conversation, but once you get a set text in with terminology and linguistic register, which might have been rather strange to the hearers, as I've said, it's likely that many in the congregation were uncomfortable and even anxious about these new religious duties being catechized in front of the community every Sunday. They didn't like it. And you can see again this from the minutes of Synod Gael, such as willfully slights the getting of the catechism par cœur, in other words, by heart. Lisa does not use diligence therein, shall be cited by their ministers before the presbytery. And look at this, a terrible thing. They whose children dies without baptism through the ignorance of their parents and want to the catechism, their parents didn't be suitably censured. So, if you didn't know the catechism, your children would not be baptized. And they're really trying hard. You had to learn the catechism by heart. And then one thing, I don't want to talk about this too much, but there's a lot of work on the English catechism going on during this decade as well, in English. And a lot of it you can see is being encouraged by what's happening with the Gaelic translation in Argyll. So you've got the synod is asking the English ministers, the English congregations in Argyll, we want a simple version of the Shorter Catechism. And also you can see this the Sum of Saving Knowledge, which is like it's like the introduction to the Shorter Catechism. It was printed with the Shorter Catechism for many, many years. That has its roots in sermons given in Inverera, in Argyll. So you see, all this is, we're not just talking about Gaelic catechisms, we're also talking about English catechisms as well here. And here's the English congregation in Inverera. They're not happy about the great untowardness there is in taking pains to learn the fundamentals of godliness, holding forth in the catechism, and the hearing of some being more from the looking glass of shame and man-pleasing than from the sense of ignorance and desire to know the ways of the Lord. So the people are standing up and they're motivated by a sense of shame to learn the catechism rather than from wanting actually to know what is inside it. Anything that learned is not laboured to be understood by the judgment, closed with by the heart and affections, and reduced to practice in the life and congregation. So they were just learning it, memorising it, and they weren't internalising the message of the catechism. So moving swiftly on to the second edition here, and this we have a copy of the second edition. 1,200 copies printed with the Psalms, as we've had, bound together with the Psalms, so it survives. It doesn't get damp and ripped apart and everything, it survives. Now, I don't know if you can see that at the bottom right, that's the translation there. They're printing the books a second time with a slight modification for some of the words in the first translation. So they've changed some of the words. Why have they changed some of the words? Because the translation was difficult for the people and incomprehensible. And they're saying because we followed the English too closely. But now they're significantly more comprehensible after a slight modification. So they had to rework the Gaelic. It was too much. It's so interesting. So here's, we can tell there's some, if we compare if you look up at the top there to this question here, talking about the sacraments become the effectual means of salvation. But in the Gaelic version at the bottom right, there's no mention of the sacraments. It's just they are. So that I suspect in the first edition, the word sacraments was judged too difficult or too strange for the people to learn. So it's taken out and they just put down they instead, because they mentioned the sacraments in the question.
They have been afraid of sacramentalism as well.
Let's get to that. We'll get to that very shortly. Yes, they were. Yes. Because they go, considering this is, why did they care about the Lord's Supper? Because there is a great variety of the celebration of the Lord's Supper in this province, occasioned much through the people's ignorance. So the people have to be catechized to understand what the Lord's Supper is and what it isn't through the catechism. So that's a very, very important part of the catechism, which when people participate in communion, they have to understand exactly what it's all about. So what I've done is I looked through the second edition and I was looking for the stuff where, where the text differs from classical Gaelic, and where vernacular forms, spoken Gaelic or close to spoken Gaelic predominate. And it's not as if the translation is, it's not as if the first edition is put through a mangle and it comes out entirely vernacular. What we see is that vernacular influence forms appear in specific questions or even in specific passages in these questions, especially where the theology is difficult, is abstruse. Now, in a way, we'd expect these would be the most difficult ones for people to understand, because the theological issues discussed in them, you've got to use very complicated grammar to explain them, and you've got to use complicated terminology as well. So we'd expect these were the ones that would be, when they were looking at the second edition, these were the ones that would be, if you like, vernacularized when it came to the second edition. But also, you know, as I say, it's a deliberate editorial strategy. And you'll see what I mean here. This is just for people that are interested in Gaelic, just to show the sort of things that I was looking for when I went through the text. So you've got initial consonant mutations, lenition, so things which are close to risha instead of risham biola in Irish. You get the third person plural possessive, so ed am fagol gusirse, they're being left to freedom, and that's different from what we'd expect in a classical Gaelic text. And then you've got phrases which you would never get in modern, in classical Irish. So we've got dochurug instead of dochurug. That's a Scotticism. Yeah. Gunther Lenching, which again is Scottish. In Irish, classical Gaelic, you'd get God Lenching. And you get things like leishan de gordi she, instead of leir ordi she. So you can see there are these differences that appear in the second edition, and these differences are places where the editor or editors, they've changed the text so it's easier for people to understand. It's not looking so strange. Now, where do these appear? Well, I was using a Taich Shiat, which shouldn't be. The conventional way of saying they are in classical Gaelic is ataich, but they've added this shiat, the pronoun shiat, in some at least of the second edition. Now that does appear in Irish as well, but I think where it appears in the Scottish context in the second edition here, it is to mark. We can see passages which have been revised from the original, as you can see, to aid understanding. And these are passages which are very, you know, they're absolutely central to Reformed theology. So we have the conviction of the total depravity and radical corruption of mankind. We have, again, going back to what Donald says there, the idea that sacraments are not inherently effective, but function through faith and by the Holy Spirit. And then we have the doctrine that the Lord's Supper involves the spiritual rather than the corporeal presence of Christ. So that's exactly, that goes back to what you were saying. It's very, very important that people that took communion had to understand that if they were in the Presbyterian Church. And so, as I said, it's where the items are theologically difficult to understand, and where the language is correspondingly difficult, that is where we get deviation from classical Gaelic norms. And they're again, absolutely central to Reformed theology. So questions about the fall, question the nature of Christ and redemption, Reformed soteriology, emphasizing the primacy of the workings of the Holy Spirit, and again, sacramental theology. So you can see that especially keen on reworking the stuff which is central to the Presbyterian doctrine. That's what they're trying to get people to understand. There's question 53 is just a funny one, because that's the text of the third commandment: don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, you can see that they've adapted. This is from Carswell, this is from the Bishop Carswell, but they've changed it slightly so that it mirrors the authorized version in English. So instead of saying, you know, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God vainly, it's replaced by engiavanas, in vain, and it's chiarna, it's of the Lord instead of God. Now, the English-speaking congregation of Inverera, to go back to them again, they didn't like people swearing. They didn't like blasphemy. And especially, as you can see there, they didn't like the frequent use of blasphemy, as is to be observed in them that speaks the Irish language. Now, the Scottish Gaelic, they really didn't like Scottish Gaelic swearing. You say a hearna probably all the time. So they were against this, and this is probably across all the ministers didn't like this. So when it was reprinted, this question, they added they added another way of saying the final bit they had another way of saying you shall not be innocent in the presence of the Lord will he be, to make it even clearer. So they had this second bit saying the Lord does not consider him innocent, and whatever the editor's intentions, both formulations of the end of the commandment were printed in the 1659 edition, and this carried on until 1800. It was printed and reprinted and reprinted. So do you see? You've got the first version in orange there, and the second version in blue, and both of them have ended up being printed together. Do you see what the ministers have done there? They either because they were so keen to stop people swearing, or they were in such a hurry doing the printing that they left both versions in, and that carried on for nearly 150 years afterwards. Now you had the two really, really strong against swearing.
One's an alternative for the other.
One is absolutely, it's an alternative, and the first one is a sort of unclear version in classical, or it's classically inflected, and then ni and mis chiarna chavis chiarna nyochentach in the second. So the two alternatives got stuck together, and they kept in there until it was redone. The short catechism was redone about 1800 or so. This is a weird one. Just we're getting towards the end. Don't worry. I mean, I'm going to finish this. But this is I couldn't but not show you this one, because it's, again, it just shows you what they were doing. Do you see the end of the question? The italics question there. Dovialochi. That is not a Gaelic word, as far as I know. It does not exist. Dovialthi, to enjoy him. What is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. To enjoy him. Dovialthi. Where does Vialochin come from? Well, there you are. It returns to Vialthin there. Well, I think this comes from the bard, the old bard, who was very shaky hand, and he was writing out. So he should have written it like that above. But do you see how he did a wee? I think at least what he did was his hand was slipping a bit when he's writing that T, and that looks like a Gaelic abbreviation, ACHD. And it was read, because he must have been reading it in a hurry, as Mialochin instead of Mialthi. So it's just these little clues there for the making, for the creation and the process that this really intriguing and amazing text went through when it was being written and when it was being rewritten. So I think that's a shaky bard's hand has led us with this word which never existed, but nevertheless found its way into a text which everybody learned for 140 years. Why did it happen? Well, I think for a start, the classical poet was no longer alive. Niall Mac Ioing had died, and he was the original corrector. But I think also the language of the catechism had to be close to spoken Gaelic, spoken Scottish Gaelic. It had to be understood by the people. It has to be memorized by the people. It had to be catechized by schoolboys going from house to house. And this is important. This is something which I've been thinking about more recently. The catechism, the Forketal, was taught through oral recitation. Now, in English, the shorter catechism was taught in schoolrooms. This was not the case in Gaelic. It was not taught in schools until, we've got the SSP. Quick. Any quick part? It's telling me something. Quick. Yeah, thanks so much. Right, only another 70 slides to go. So we've got this book here called, you can see it on the right there, called Learning to Read, Learning Religion. The catechism was used across Europe and across the world as a school text. It was a text you learnt in primary school. A broad range of material for novice readers. It's the Christian ABC. Doesn't matter what your denomination was, they were used in schools throughout Europe, including in the Scottish lowlands. Now, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say the sort of language in that shorter catechism may have been just as strange to Lowland Scots speakers as classical Gaelic was to Scottish Gaelic speakers. High register, standard English, but nevertheless, because it was taught in schools, because it was memorized, and because they had the Bible as a reinforcement for this, standard English was understood by Lowland Scots in a way which wasn't the case for classical Irish, or classical Gaelic, I should say, and Scottish Gaelic speakers, at least not immediately. We'll get on to this. There's another twist. Carile an So here's me saying it. The schools of the Synod of Argyll, they want to set up schools that they were English speaking. You learnt English in the schools of the Synod of Argyll. They weren't set up to teach Gaelic. So again, because it was oral, it had to be closer to the popular vernacular. Here we go. Let's go. And I suspect also the Psalms might have had something to do with it. The Psalms were a bit more accessible. They're a bit more vernacular. They're a bit closer to the spoken language. Why? Because the presenter who was reading it had immediately to grasp, while they were singing in the process, he had to grasp what he was going to sing, the line he was going to take. It had to be in a form accessible to popular congregations, and it had to be suitable to Lowland psalm tunes, which followed an accentual meter. Da, 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 da. Sorry, I'm only losing one speaker. I've lost a lot more before. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. Rather than the syllabic meter, which would be used in classical Gaelic. So it's a different meter. And because of that, it had to be more vernacular in style. So this sort of it shifts the Overton window, as it were, regarding what could be printed. Now, there are politics at work here in 1659, because this, as you can see, it's the fall, it's the last days of the English Republic. Cromwell has died. No other period in the country's history rivals it for turmoil and confusion. The Republic was falling to pieces. Was a new civil war to be on the horizon, especially in the Highlands? So you can see why the Synod of Argyll are trying to shove this out into the public domain as soon as possible. Never mind translating the whole 150 Psalms. We're going to translate the first 50 Psalms. We don't have time to do the first 150. It's the 50, and the 50 as well. These are much more warlike psalms as well, the early psalms, and I think that was part of it. You know, this is the songbook for the brosnoch na gledoch, brosnoch na brostenoch, in this new massive conflict which is going to break out all over Britain. So the Synod were genuinely worried. And that is one of the reasons why they were trying to get this. There's this sort of flurry of printing going on right at the very end of the 1650s. But as we know, Charles came back to the throne, Episcopal Church restored, Presbyterian Church out in its ear. Marks of Argyll, head of the Synod of Argyll, beheaded for treason, and the publishing initiatives of the Synod of Argyll was stalled. Unexpected aftermath, what maybe might have been. So no more Psalms published by the Synod of Argyll, no Gaelic Bible. How much, and we've heard that already from Donald, how might Scottish Gaelic history have been different if a Gaelic Bible had been published as planned? Yeah. But nevertheless, there's a cadel on Cuchog. How vernacular would the Synod's Bible have been? We shall never know. But, well, maybe I'll find it in some dusty corner. I mean, who's going to throw out the Old Testament in Gaelic? Aye. Yeah, we're waiting. One day. I'm not looking hard enough. But if they intended to print the Old Testament with O'Donnell, as we've seen, generally classical Gaelic New Testament, how Scottish Gaelic would it have been? Anyway, it's a question for the ages. We don't know. We don't know. So it may well have been a classical Gaelic Bible, or more classical Gaelic Bible. We don't know. But we know, as I've said, they were still extant in the 1690s, and the Presbyterian Church regained authority in the country. And the Synod of Ardgally must be gnashing their teeth because their version of the Old Testament could not now be printed because Kirk had sneaked in ahead of them, gone down to London and got it printed. At the very time when the Presbyterian Church was taking over Scotland, Kirk had gone down to London and he had got the Bible printed in classical Gaelic and Roman type. Oh, it's just an amazing man. But Kirk's Bible was distributed across the Scottish Highlands already. Just very quickly, I was reading through the Marks of Athol, the letters, and in around about 1690 or so, there are letters saying that there was a poltergeist in some Perth library. And the poltergeist, he's writing about this poltergeist, which had appeared in the library, and it had been knocking the Gaelic Bibles off the shelf, which the Marquis of Athol had collected to distribute among his servants and his ministers. So it's just weird things like, yeah. I wondered if it was maybe a Synod of Argyll poltergeist. It was this very, very, very strange letter. So anyway, if maybe the history of Scottish Gaelic might have been different, we don't know. But Gaelic speaking, but this is the carala here. Gaelic speaking congregations do get used to the shorter catechism. The reason why is, one, Presbyterian is embedded in across much of the Highlands, and generations grew used to the religious discourse, used to the theology, and how it was expounded in the Gaelic Short Catechism. And now I'm going to say something different to Donald here, but it's not too different because I'm actually drawing on what you're saying. And I'm going to say, not only was there a straight line, but there is a line going up in classical Gaelic, because maybe people got reaccustomed to listening and to understanding classical Gaelic, because now they had Beadle's Bible with them, which they didn't have before. So that maybe it was, maybe it's an analogous process to Lowland Scots growing used to hearing the High Register Standard English of the Authorised Version. So I'm going to throw this in, that maybe we got more used to hearing that High Register classical Gaelic across the Highlands because of Beadle's Bible, and because of that, people got more used to the sort of this sort of hybrid mongrel language in the shorter catechism as well. And they had to memorize it as well. And then just to finish off with that, I've got to put in Alistair MacFaisher Alistair somewhere. He begins his poetry collection, Ashely, na Sinnathan an Alapnich, in 1751, with this poem, the Mulligan Utart and Sinnathan Gaelic, to the author's praise of the ancient Gaelic language. And it begins with an echo of the first question in the shorter catechism. It is the chief end for every language under the sun. Gachhainch van Green, gur smuachin asford a fartoch of Grichel, at nyanching a ruske ges runar kri, ler griaf, ler gulan, sword chured at G. So every language under the sun, to share our thriving thoughts with each other, discover our purposes, the programmatic statement at the very beginning of the collection, and he is using the shorter catechism as a template for this. It's not a joke, it's a tribute to the shorter catechism, because he was a catechist, as we know, for many years, and he knew that how difficult it was, how challenging it was to translate it, and it shows off Gaelic at its best. And look at the penultimate line. You see these parentheses, the brackets. That is also used in the shorter catechism to emphasize language. They don't use italics. They don't have an italic script. They use these little, so that is Alistair saying, with our action and with our conduct, he's emphasizing that. And it's a wee bit a mischievous allusion to the Forkidal, the shorter catechism. Unassuming, but hugely influential little book. So next time I'm at the Highland, if you'll ever invite me back after this, I'll talk about this. Well, maybe myself and Donald will talk about this, about the Gaelic Psalms and this amazing manuscript in Blair Castle Archive, which I think was stolen from the Synod of Argyll, and it's in Blair Athol. It's such an amazing, important manuscript. But anyway, that's for another time. Aye. So anyway, thanks very much, and that's quite enough for one. Thank you.
I mean, what's a wee bit of time? Thank you so much.
No, thank
both
you.
Of you,
That's
both
good.
of you. What's a wee bit of time to start? So I don't. We got about 10 minutes at very most. Just if there are a couple of questions from the floor.
Or from line as well.
Or from online too. If anybody has, there's a hand. Is there a hand up there?
It's still alive.
Aye, they're still with us.
They're still with us. And they haven't. If anybody, Rob, can you see if there's anybody wanting to ask a question from there? And if so, can they speak? Can we hear them? If we can hear them, that would be great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, move on.
Please speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Combination was some fall off.
Anyone hear me?
Kevin on the head.
Kevin, can you go ahead?
Oh, if you can hear me, I have to go now. So just a very quick point on the point about ministers being intermediaries between the sort of Beatles translation and the congregation. A modern instance of that, I was in an Irish Gaelic course in Donegal, and I went to the church, and the priest was reading out from the Bible, but it didn't correspond to what was written at all. He was just fluently and reinterpreting it into Donegal Irish rather than the Munster biased modern translation. So, and he was doing that totally naturally because the Munster Irish would have been foreign to him and the congregation. To the people in their own
I mean, we've looked really question have mic, yeah, as a showmer, the mic in the room is off, so
Yes.
none of us can hear you.
Show Mike either east. Oh,
Hang on.
could you put that one off, the mic off there? Tis. Oh, right. Is your mic on? My mic is on, yeah.
It's off again.
When my mic is on, we hear an echo. Oh, we can. Aye. There we are. There we. No, we're still there. No, just going to say that the Episcopalian, way of government was very good for translating. Because if you want something done in a hurry, the bishop would crack the whip, and we saw that being done with the Manx Bible.
I've also got a question from Donald. What you mentioned about the printers.
Yep.
I didn't struggle with now at the moment, but it's a double question really, because the Private doesn't sound a very Scottish name to me.
No.
And also with the printers, the compositors not have been more used in Latin anyway.
Yes, they would have been. What amazes me about Leckrich was how accurate he did Parsons School. And I would love to know why he was so good. It's a beautiful piece of work. And it compares very favourably with the Scottish Gaelic text edition. It eclipses the Scottish Gaelic text edition in terms of its presentation. A beautiful piece of work. I would love to know far more about Leckrich. They would have been masters of Latin, I'm quite sure.
Yes.
English too. But Gaelic must have been quite a challenge for them to composite.
Yeah, I think we can see that he printed all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Including stuff which wasn't necessarily particularly religious in
no.
tone. So he was a sort of a jobbing printer. And I think when this came up, he jumped in and decided to do it.
He did a great job.
And he did a fantastic job of it, yes.
I'm just amazed at how beautifully the text is laid out.
Yes.
And with little decorations and so on.
Yes.
Again, very interesting for a Presbyterian.
To be fair, if you had a 7-foot man breathing down your neck like Caswell was,
Yes,
I think you'd want to do as good a job as possible.
He was a powerful boy.
Yes.
Yes. But I mean,
Yeah.
there are all these questions still to be asked. I mean, has anyone studied Leckrich? Has there a full,
Yes,
who's done it?
it's done on history of the book in Scotland during that period, and also I think was it Adam Fox who did a wonderful book in cheap print in Scotland, and I think that he has a leading role in that book towards the start of it as well. So there has been somewhat done.
A double answer to your question,
Aye.
Lane Valley. Get this man on. He knows
Donlan
every
stereo.
and Karani.
Well, if I don't, I make it up. So that's any more? Is that?
Well, I think
That's us.
that's maybe us. We've certainly been at it for a while. Obviously, some of the technical things took up time, but we persevered, and I think we did more than that. We've reached quite a high summit, I think, which we can look down
Yes.
with a much better understanding of where we've come from at 2 o'clock today. So I really appreciate what you've contributed to both of us to our understanding of
Thank you.
these things. I know that the whole kind of vernacular thing brought to mind what Stapleton says there, the great Catholic Counter-Reformation scholar, original English, but in France, writes that the Protestants have got a nerve in translating to the vernacular, because when you translate to vernacular, you try to be more specific about what Hebrew and Greek words mean. Because you want people to understand, but it's your understanding.
That's
Let the mystery be a bit, because we don't necessarily know what these words are. So that is also
Protestants are getting above themselves,
exactly.
pretending that they know.
Yes.
So thanks again.
Oh, thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all those online. Thanks for the safe persevering, and I hope you've appreciated that. Do get back to us by email or something if you wish to follow anything up. And we'll pass it on to the two of them. Thank you.
Folks.
Yep. There we are.